While this deconstruction is necessary, there are also questions that come with it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're not going to follow that with a reconstruction, what are we going to be? A bunch of nihilists? What are we going to be? Isn't there going to be chaos?
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward.
For inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up, talk about this week's presidential debate, and then also take time to remember September the 11th, 2001. Later on in the pod, Missy and I sat down with Marianne Williamson. Marianne's got a brand new book out titled The Mystic Jesus and the Mind of Love. It is a great episode that you're not going to want to miss, so stay tuned. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I am great. How are you?
I'm so uncomfortable.
Is it the heat? What's going on?
No, the heat, oddly enough, is subsiding. Yay.
Yes.
Yay. No, it is debate week.
It is debate week.
It has been, yes. So we had the debate earlier this week. I detest watching debates, right?
Yes.
They make me so uncomfortable. I have the biggest love-hate relationship with awkward moments, and they're so awkward. And you made me watch.
I did make you watch it. I did.
The debate.
All right. So
and I have not gotten over there's not enough showers to wash off the awkwardness.
Well, for our 4 listeners in the island of Samoa, there was a presidential debate this week between former President Donald Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris. And it was in the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia,
and
Pennsylvania.
Didn't you feel that love?
I did feel the love.
Okay.
Now, what's funny to me is that it was also the city that was a setting behind Rocky. So it was more of a Rocky film than it was.
True.
Yeah.
Okay, true. As I should know that.
Yes, it was. Just picture this, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, we're sitting there watching the
As if
debate.
they didn't watch it, right?
Right. But every time Missy would get uncomfortable, the Afghan that she was keeping warm with would go over her head.
Which pretty much meant the entire time. I cannot stand that. When you're standing next to somebody and just trashing them right next to each other. Don't you know you're supposed to talk about each other behind their backs? I mean, this is the way we do
it's
it.
the American way. That's right.
Don't say it to your face.
Oh, goodness.
It was awkward, but I survived.
So lots transpired over the 2-hour debate that I watched and you listened to.
And by the time this drops, we will all have seen 547 memes about it, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't know. Do you have any commentary? Because I have commentary to end with.
Yeah, what stood out to you the most in the 2 hours we
I'm
watched the
saving
debate?
mine for the end, so
Okay.
you go ahead.
Well, first of all, I do want to address this. There's a lot of people in America today that believe debates don't matter. I think they matter a great deal. In one of the most significant debates in recent time, we had a presidential candidate who is the sitting president of the United States drop out of the race based upon one debate. So anybody who says these debates don't matter, they're wrong. They do matter. And so, I've always contended that you really can't score a lot of points in a debate necessarily, but you sure can lose them.
You can do a lot of damage.
A lot of damage. And we saw that with President Biden in the last debate. And so we enter into this debate with eyes wide open, and it was interesting. You had kind of the first time you saw Kamala Harris as the nominee for the Democrats, and of course, former President Trump, the nominee for the Republicans. And 2 different styles, Missy, 2 different styles.
Yeah, it was interesting. And you just bringing up that point about debates not mattering. I mean, it just sparked a memory of just a few weeks ago. I mean, probably 5 or 6 now, when we had Matthew Dowd on to talk about after Trump was shot. And we had him on to talk. That was before President Biden had dropped out.
Right.
And he was even talking about the debate. George W. Bush had a poor performance in a debate. And he said the benefit for him is that he had another debate in 11 days.
Right.
So he could kind of redeem himself. And just, we talked about in that episode about Biden, he doesn't have another one until September, which was this week. And just kind of the difference in that. And so that just proved to be true, that it can really impact your campaign.
Yeah.
Clearly.
Well, it was interesting to watch this week. One of the things that stood out to me was Vice President Harris really baiting the former president time and time again. And he, wanted to talk about American carnage and how horrible the state of America is right now, and place the blame on the doorstep of Biden and Harris, which that's a tactic, and certainly has the right to make that argument. But she quickly pivoted and got him making some statements. Some, Missy, were just off the rails.
Yeah, I think from what I have seen and read in the days that follow, I think the general consensus from everybody except him is that she took this one. Okay, score one. Yeah. Now he took the last one. Score one for him. Absolutely. So, it happens. But I only have one assessment.
Okay.
Post debate, and that is that I don't know what you believe, but my golly, cats are having a moment. I mean,
yeah.
In our world, in our political climate, like, cats are the real winner. Well, I don't know about winners. They're having a moment.
They are having a moment.
They're either being eaten or they're being like raised instead of children. Like, we're either deciding to raise them in lieu of having children, or we're deciding to eat them because we're hungry. Anyways, it's a mess. You can't make this up. But I'm just like, also in our lives, because we have, Kat, if you're a regular listener, Kat, who has befriended us and become part of our lives. Yeah. So I'm really struggling. You and I have never been cat people ever.
No.
But I'm just like, I'm having to embrace the moment of the cat.
It is the season of the cat. It is the year of the cat.
So no matter who you believe won, I'm just thinking the cats are the ones that are having the real moment here.
Yeah. And so you're alluding to the moment in the debate where former President Trump retold a false story, and it's been debunked in numerous sources, that Haitian immigrants in Ohio are eating cats and dogs, like pulling them out of people's yards and just like sauteing them up right there. I mean, it was really asinine, really bizarre. And I watched a little bit of the spin afterwards, and one of the CNN reporters had vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance on, and he was, again, re-emphasizing the story. And she said, Senator Vance, if somebody called your office and said they saw Sasquatch, would you then go on national television and tell everybody the Sasquatch is real? He didn't know what to do with that. But
yeah, well, okay, I was actually kind of thinking about what happened right after the debate when Tay went on her Instagram with a picture with her cat.
Yeah, she did.
And decided to make public that she was endorsing, or she was going, I don't know if it was an official endorsement, but she said, this is where I'm placing my vote.
Yeah.
And so, which is interesting.
It was interesting. And, that was probably the second biggest, if not the biggest story of the night coming out of the debate, is that Taylor Swift endorsed the Harris campaign. And it was interesting how, this is one of the reasons I really appreciate Taylor Swift as an artist and as a person, because she talked about her doing her own research and encouraging her audience to do their own research.
She said, these are my values. This is what I feel strongly about, and left it at that. It wasn't snarky. It wasn't like, I don't know, mic drop. It was just like, here it is for me.
Yeah.
And also, here's a picture of me with my cat.
Very true. Very true. Well, anyway, big week this week. It's going to be interesting to see how this unfolds. We're a little over 50 days to the election in November. So, keep it here with we've got hot political opinions here.
Right. Hot takes by Mitch and Missy.
That's right. Well, Missy, not only did the debate occur on Tuesday of this week, but on Wednesday, the country took a moment to pause and remember September the 11th, 2001. And you and I have been talking about this prior to recording today. And we were just kind of sharing our memories of 9/11. And one of the things that I brought up was I am starting to get really troubled by the fact that 9/11 is surprising me as it approaches. I am forgetting about that date. And that was probably one of the most significant days in my life. And I was just so traumatized. I was so mesmerized by it. The idea of 9/11 was just part of my vernacular and thinking for probably a decade.
Right.
And now, several decades later, it's not an afterthought. I still think about it, but it's something that is now...
It's not marked as indelibly on your soul, I think. And yeah, when you said that, you were really bothered by it. I understand. But also, I agree with what you're saying. It's troubling. It's like time heals, and that is what is supposed to happen.
Right.
At the same time, there are moments in life that we need to have that. We need to remember. We need to not forget what got us to that point because we don't want to repeat history in that regard. And so, it's like it's such a blessing in a time. It's a blessing and a curse because we do need to remember that it does need to still leave a mark, and we need to make sure we don't allow these things to happen again, that we govern, that we act, as a global community in such a way that doesn't lead to these events. And we could mark several other events since that time. And I think that's part of the problem is we've been inundated by catastrophic happenings, whether it's, mass shootings or whether it's wars or whether it's other, big events, or like you and I even talked about in the course of that conversation, Jan 6. I mean, that was only, a few short years ago.
Right.
And yet we're already becoming a little bit numb to that. And it is like, you need that time. But also, I don't know what the answer is of how do we still stay so engaged in understanding what got us to those points and try to ensure they don't happen again, but also heal at the same time. I don't have an answer.
No. Last thing I want to say about this is that listening to the remembrance moments on 9/11 this week, what really got me, and it always gets me, and I forget about it again, but then in New York and in Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C., when they ring that bell and they read the names of those that were killed, it's so important to name the individuals who lost their lives. And hearing those names read really humanized that day for me. And I think it's something that we must never forget in these days, whether that is, historical days in the history of the world, America, that these were real flesh and bone moments. These were real people doing things that cemented that day and those moments in history. And so when I hear those names, it really, really touches me and really reminds me of the significance of these days. So I hope that we never forget the sacrifices that were made on 9/11 and other dates, that we take time and pause. So
I agree.
Yep. Well, we get to sit down with a wonderful guest this week. Marianne Williamson has a brand new book out titled The Mystic Jesus and the Mind of Love. And I just had a ball with Marianne. I mean, she's got some great concepts and ideas, some new concepts that I have never been exposed to. And I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed our conversation with her.
Absolutely. I was captivated by the book and even more so by the conversation. yes, I'm just kind of transfixed by her thinking and trying to rework my brain to work more like hers.
Right.
It's going to take a minute, right? It's a process, but I'll get there.
So stay tuned. Missy and I'll be right back with Marianne Williamson.
So much of what I learned in church was about doing instead of being. Pray this prayer, affirm this belief, save your soul. But doesn't our faith teach us that there's nothing we can do to earn or escape God's love? I'm Brett Harris, host of God Knows Where, and if we can't do anything, then I think we need to better understand who we're supposed to be. Join me for Wayfinding, a new series exploring Jesus' parables to discover who God calls us to be. Find God Knows Where on your favorite podcast platform.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Marianne Williamson is an internationally acclaimed author and lecturer. For the last 35 years, she has been one of America's most well-known public voices, having been a popular guest on television programs such as Oprah, Larry King Live, Good Morning America, and Bill Maher. 7 of her 12 published books have been New York Times bestsellers, and 4 have hit #1. Her latest book, The Mystic Jesus, The Mind of Love, is currently available wherever you purchase your reading materials. Marianne, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Miriam, first of all, congrats on the book. It was wonderful. I just was so captivated by everything you had to say in it. So I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today and talk about it. I want to begin with asking you talk a lot in the book about A Course in Miracles, which was something I was not familiar with. So I imagine a lot of our listenership may not be as well. So will you talk about The Course in Miracles, how you utilize it as an important guide for your life and spirituality, and how it kind of is really foundational for your book?
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words that you said about the book. It means a lot to me. A Course in Miracles has been described as a self-study program of spiritual psychotherapy based on universal spiritual themes. And that's a phrase from the Course, that it is based on universal spiritual themes. And it is really a course in the practice of forgiveness. It's about surrendering or dismantling, it says, a thought system based on fear and accepting instead a thought system based on love. So it calls itself a psychological mind training whose students come from, as the Course says, all religions and no religions. So it is a spiritual, like I said, psychological mind training, but there is no dogma, there is no doctrine. It does use traditional Christian terms, but it uses these terms in very non-traditional, what you might think of as psychotherapeutic ways. Some people who are traditional Christians find it a great embellishment of what they already believe. One of the things I think is very unique in the Course is that it gives people who do not identify as Christians, and I found, as I mentioned in the book, this is not just people such as myself, born into other religions, being Jewish such as I am, or agnostic or atheist, but it also gives people who have a lot of ambivalence, who themselves were brought up Christian, but I find almost have more of a resistance than some of the people who were not, because of whatever their concepts are that they were fed as children, but have found, as many people have today, that they rejected certain institutional religious structures and then found out they'd thrown away the baby with the bathwater. So I think it's helped a lot of people come back to those Christian terms with sort of a clear slate in their heart and mind, contextualizing these terms in a way that has actually brought them home. So everybody comes from a different place. And I think the Jesus part that's been so interesting, he says in the Course, the Course is not about believing in God. It's about believing in one another. And in our belief and in our love for one another, that is the experience of God, whether we quote unquote believe or not. The Course in Miracles says belief is ultimately meaningless, but experience is everything. That's the experience of unconditional love, forgiveness, and so forth. Some people, I don't really think you can study the course and leave out God. I actually don't think
Yeah.
but you could study the course, and many people say, I just don't want to go to the Jesus part.
Right.
Right.
It does say in the course, there is something, and these are not the specific words. I'd have to look up the specific, but this is very, very close. You do not have to believe in me in order for this course to work for you. If you do believe in me, there's that little bit more I could do for you. Those are
Wow.
not the exact words, but that's why I wanted to write. I had written a book called A Return to Love, which I always jokingly say is the Cliff Notes of the Course in Miracles.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Yeah.
With this book, I sort of take on the issue of Jesus. You know, in the world today, and I can't speak about other countries, but I know in the United States, there's obviously a spiritual explosion going on,
Mhm.
which in most ways is very good.
Mhm.
But there is this, we'll talk about Buddha, we'll talk about goddesses and God, all the stuff they'll talk about in this almost like, I don't want to go into the Jesus thing.
Right.
But then when they talk about all the incredible things and miracles, I go, well, you know, Jesus did that too, you know.
Mhm.
Jesus said that too, you know. And so with this book, I hope to contribute to whatever, you know, listen, whenever you write a book, you're hoping that something you say or write provides some level of aha moment.
I mean, I had several, and I'm still trying to figure it out. So I really want to have a more in-depth conversation about this, but I'm like, I need to marinate on all this a little bit longer. I think what you said a minute ago about fear and love.
Yeah.
And it just immediately took me back to those of us who grew up being taught Jesus's love, and that's, you know, we went to the church community to find that, but then the message we received was one of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's real hard. Like, I loved everything you said, and it made so much sense. But when you talked about choosing, you know, love over fear, I'm like, I'm fearful of that.
Wow.
So
Okay.
like, how do you, you know, untangle that mess? But I really loved all the things you said.
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciated about the book, Marianne, is that it does seem to fill a void currently present today. There's a lot of deconstruction taking place across the faith landscapes within evangelicalism especially, but really across all faiths. And that deconstruction has to do with the questioning of systems and orthodoxy that have been present for some time. But there really isn't something for people to lean into for the future, and people are trying to figure that out. And I think by the Course in Miracles, as well as the mystic Jesus concepts that we're going to get to here in a bit, you're providing at least that pathway forward. And I really appreciated that. For those of us who are engaging in lots of deconstructing right now, there is something to hold on to. So thank you for giving that to us.
Well, thank you. And I think everything that you said is not only true about the faith landscape, it's true about the political landscape,
100%.
about the economic landscape. I think it's true about the human landscape.
Mm-hmm.
We're living at a profound moment of historic phase transition. I think this will be looked back at that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, during the Renaissance, people didn't look at each other and say, I think it's a Renaissance. Do you think it's a Renaissance? Surely they would have known, wow, something major big is in the air.
Right. Absolutely.
And there are times in history. Now, what you just said is both the peril and the opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Because while this deconstruction is necessary, there are also questions that come with it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if you're not going to follow that with a reconstruction, what are we going to be? A bunch of nihilists? What are we going to be? Isn't
Right.
there going to be chaos? Or sometimes in cases like that, the system that comes to replace it is sometimes almost a worse kind of orthodoxy because people are so afraid that nobody seems in charge here.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I think the conversations about how do we replace? How do we go from an economy based on one thing to an economy based on another thing?
Right.
How can we go from energy based on one thing to energy based on another thing? It can't just be don't do that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be a transition of love, of wisdom, taking the best from the old orthodoxies.
Mm-hmm.
Most of these orthodoxies, it's not like there was no good in them. You know, you want to be really careful and sober and theologically sober and psychologically sober and socially sober and economically sober, or people fall through the cracks.
Right. Right.
You know, my daughter, it's interesting. My daughter is her subject was religious history,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly in England. And her dissertation was about when Henry VIII transitioned from Catholicism into what would become the Church of England.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, Mommy, when they closed the monasteries, there were all these women who were Catholic sisters, Catholic nuns at the time. There were no phones, there were no emails, there were no letter, who had no family. There was no one to go home to, and they were just thrown on the street.
Mm.
Well, that's obviously an extreme
Right.
example,
Sure.
but it is an example, however dramatic, of the need to, in times of change, be very wise and very responsible in the human effect of such changes.
Mm-hmm.
And showing enough respect for people whose lives, whose belief system, whose living, whatever it was ensconced in that which needs to pass away.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are two magic times in life, birth and death. Like there's the magic hour of sunrise and there's the magic hour of sunset.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody who's had any kind of ministerial function knows that being at the birth of a child and being there for people at the hour of death, those are two very sacred moments to hold in a very sacred context with great love. I remember the time I had this realization that the angel of death would be actually the most tender angel.
Mm.
The angel that's God sending you at a moment like that.
Yeah.
So that's what I believe about this deconstruction.
Yeah.
I think of Course in Miracles as a kind of a psychological path in the deconstruction of one thought system, like you said, a thought system based on fear. And the workbook of the Course, which the Course says is the crux of the Course, is 365 days worth of exercises, daily lessons. And it says the first half of the year is dismantling a thought system based on fear, and the second half, building up a thought system based on love.
Okay, so now let's turn our attention to the mystic Jesus. You do a fabulous job, Marianne, in the book describing what the mystic Jesus is, but also what the mystic Jesus is not. You even recall a story in Central Park when someone asked you and your friend if you were saved. So in recalling that story, you did a marvelous job expounding on your ideas. So can you help our audience understand more thoroughly what you mean when you say the mystic Jesus?
And if you're saved.
Okay. Well, that's a perfect example of the Christian terms, right, that are so different. Sure. So back in the 1970s, you might not remember, you might not be old enough to remember, but I do. The people who were really the precursor to a lot of the new evangelical movement were called Jesus freaks.
Oh, yeah. I remember them.
So, are you saved by Jesus? Are you saved by Jesus? Well, this is a perfect example of words that we associate with traditional Christianity, that are part of traditional Christianity, but have a very, I don't even want to say different, because I would say it's a filter that may or may not align. From a Course in perspective, the only thing to be saved from is the insane fear-based thinking that now dominates this world. You know, like in O Holy Night, long lay the world in sin and error pining, till he appeared and the soul felt its worth. You were in sin, i.e. what the Course calls mistaken thoughts, and pining, anxiety and depressed because of it, because you don't see the beauty in one another. And he says in the Course, you think you have to know someone well enough to know whether or not they're worthy of your love. But I'm telling you, until you love them, you cannot know them. But we are, the Course says, under the spell in a way. It says that in the Bible, it says Adam fell asleep. Nowhere does it say that he woke up, that humanity has been asleep to the deeper truth. And in our sleep, the Course in Miracles says the nightmares have come. And these nightmares are born of our thinking that we are separate from one another. And out of the fear that comes from that, We instinctively, the Course says, from a very early age, it feels natural to us to judge one another. It feels natural to us to attack one another, and feels unnatural to us to just love one another. So what we're being saved from is the thought system that has been in charge of the planet so long. Look at America today. It's so mean. Everybody's so mean. We can't just have oh, that's interesting that you say it that way. I say it that way. Everybody like social media. No, you're bad to think it that way. Not only are you bad to look at it that way, you should never say it again. I mean, what is going on in our world? But it's such an example. We're attacking one another. We're judging one another. And then the Course says, of course, which once again goes along with tradition. If you look at it, it's not enough to not say anything to that person if you're even thinking it.
Yeah.
The Course in Miracles says all thought creates form on some level.
So in our world, anything growing up, anything that if you had put mystic in front of Jesus, you would have immediately been ostracized, at least, from that community, because you definitely don't put anything around him that symbolizes any sort of witchcraft or sorcery or hippy dippy stuff. So help us for those of us.
Theological term, hippy dippy.
Yes. So for those of us who have never known those two terms put together, yes, just give us a brief idea of what that means.
Okay. So one of the things I talk about at the beginning of the book, there's a book that came out several years ago called The Gnostic Gospels by a woman named Elaine Pagels. Have you ever read that book?
I have.
She's fascinating to me. And she talks about the history of Christendom. And she talks about how starting at a very early time after the birth of Jesus, that there were two main arteries of thought. And one was what would ultimately become the ecclesiastic tradition of the church. The other was what has often been called the Gnostics. And there had been these Gnostic teachings, Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart. There has always been the esoteric mystical, and a lot of it has to do with whether or not the church is necessary to broker your relationship in terms of the Holy Spirit. These are very big questions, obviously. But the point that is made in her book is that historically, if you go back long enough, these were not little tributaries. These were major traditions. And then when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, the Gospel of Thomas, and so forth. So the Course in Miracles, let's take that traditional line, there is only one begotten Son. Now this, I admit, this does sound radical to some traditional Christians. Take the line, there's only one begotten Son. So from the traditional Christian perspective, that means Jesus is the Son of God and there is no other. From the esoteric or Gnostic or mystical tradition, there is only one begotten Son means God only created one of us. There is one Son. And we have fallen into the belief that there are billions and billions of us, because on the physical level, of course, there are.
Right.
Spiritually, we are one, but we are inundated by a thought system that tells us that we are separate. So when Jesus said, love one another, it's because to love one another is to see one another. And when you see one another, you see your oneness. Now, there was a Swiss psychologist named Carl Jung. Carl Jung said, if you go deep enough into your mind and deep enough into mine, there are mental images that we share called archetypes. The idea of the Christ mind, once again, these Christian terms, wow, is that if you go deep enough into your mind and deep enough into mine, there's only one mind. God created only one of us. That it's like the hub of a wheel and all the spokes, and we identify the spokes with their position on the rim. But if you go deep enough into the hub, there's one center point. That's the Christ mind. Now, the Course in Miracles says that Christ exists in all of you. There is someone, and this is also radical to many. The Course says he's not the only one, but if he is your teacher, you know it, and you need no other. There is one who has lived on the earth and so actualized the consciousness of the Holy Spirit being the direct communication link between God and us in a separated state, that he has no thought except the thoughts of the Christ mind. The Course says he lived on the earth, but thought only the thoughts of heaven, being an awareness of our oneness. So that you can say Jesus the Christ, because although he lived as a man, his mind was completely healed of the fears of this world. That is the mystic interpretation of him. And the Course would then say, and these are not the exact words, but this is the teaching, that his having achieved that state, he was then authorized by God to help those of us who are not at that state, once again, cannot force us because that would be a violation of our free will. But should we request, and we've all seen the picture of Jesus with the lantern at the door.
Oh, yeah.
If you choose to say, I want the Holy Spirit, because at that point he had become, the Course says, so at one with God that to call on the Holy Spirit is to call on Jesus, to call on Jesus is to call on the Holy Spirit being the connecting link that we can't hear because it's too confusing on this earth. We can't always get there by ourselves. You and I could have lunch, right? And I could be telling you that I am very angry at somebody. And you could say, Marianne, you're bigger than that. You're bigger than that. Come on, let it go.
Yeah.
And it might be a situation where I'd say, thank you for reminding me. You're right.
Mm-hmm.
But it might be something where who I'm angry at did something so egregious. It is such a wound, or it was such a betrayal, or it was such a loss, such a trigger, that I can't do it by myself.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus is someone, he says, my mind joined with your mind can shine away your ego. And I can say, I am willing to see this differently. I am willing to have you come into my mind and help me make that leap. And the Course says the miracle there is that divine intercession from a thought system beyond our own, that he is authorized by God. If I'm willing to see the innocence in that person, that on my human personality, I can't. It's too big for me.
Wow.
So I think that conversation about that you made about the spoke and being of one mind feeds perfectly into the next thing I want to ask about, which is the ego. You talk quite a bit in the book about the ego and how it works against our ability to fulfill what God truly desires for us. And as I was listening to that part of the book, I kept thinking of just shooting ourselves in the foot kind of thing. So talk to our listeners a little bit about the ego and how it does work against us.
Well, first of all, the word ego, it's used in many different ways in today's psychological, constructs. Mm-hmm. The way the Course uses it is kind of like the ancient Greeks used it. It's the very idea of a small separated self. So the Course says an idea does not leave its source. You cannot be separate from God. What God creates is one with him, is an extension of who he is. You can't cut it off. You can think you cut it off, but you can't cut it off. And what God creates is eternal and unalterable. The ego is the false belief that you can. The ego is the false belief that I am separate from God. The ego is the false belief that I'm separate from you. The ego is false belief that I'm separate from the rest of the universe when God created it all as one. On the level of the body, you're in Nashville, I'm in New York. On the level of the spirit, there is no time and space. There's one of us here. There is no place. There's a wonderful line in the Course in Miracles that to me is a perfect illustration of this. The Course in Miracles says, you're like a sunbeam to the sun, thinking you're separate from other sunbeams. You are like a wave in the ocean, thinking you're separate from other waves. So now think about this, because there's really no place where one sunbeam stops and another starts. Mm-hmm. There's really no place where one wave stops and another starts. But think psychologically of the difference. If I'm one wave in the ocean, and I think I'm separate from the rest of the ocean, how could I not live in constant terror of annihilation? How could I not live in constant terror that some wave that's bigger than me is going to overwhelm me? And that's how we live. Mm-hmm. The Course says, so the way the Course teaches it is, okay, if I'm a wave and I know that I'm one with every other wave, I'm safe here.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
wave moves, I move, there's nothing for me to fear.
Right.
That's a great
And so the
visualization.
ego
Yeah, that is a great visualization.
is your own mind. The Course in Miracles says your power is an extension of the mind of God. You are free. Your free will means freedom of thought. God's will means love's thought.
Mm-hmm.
You are free to think whatever you want to think, but what you cannot do is diminish the power of your thinking.
Yeah.
So if you think you're separate, that's, in a way, it's an attack on God.
Mm.
It's self-love turned into self-hate. It's love and forgiveness turned into pathology and neurosis.
Yeah.
Freud defined neurosis as separation from self. If I don't see the love in you, I can't see the love in me. If I can't see the innocence in you, I can't feel the innocence in me.
Yeah.
If I can't live for you, I can't live for me.
I love that. I love that. So another topic I want to talk about, Marianne, in the book is that you do a fabulous job talking about how some people fall into the trap of dualism, separating the spiritual and physical worlds. And you've talked a little bit about this already in our conversation, but you keep them together in this essential symbiotic relationship. And this spoke to me in so many ways. I'm an indigenous person, a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation. And in my deconstruction of my colonial self, I am doing more and more self-study about my indigenous heritage and indigenous belief systems. And part of that belief system is the non-separation between the physical and spiritual worlds. And you talk about this. You talk about you can't separate the physical and spiritual world because it's all encompassing. Why is that so important for us to grasp?
The Course in Miracles says nothing in the world that you see, is unholy or holy except as determined by its purpose. Anything in the physical world that I see to be used for the purposes of love is a holy thing.
Mm-hmm.
If you and I, which I assume we all did, entered into this podcast asking that in some way love prevail, that we present our best to one another, that we use our talents and our expertise in order to lift things up, in order to lift each other up, in order to hopefully be of service to someone listening, then this podcast is holy.
Mm-hmm.
But if we are only looking at it, oh, maybe I can get something from this, from what can I get rather than what can I give? How can I exploit? How can I use my ego, my separate self? Then it becomes an unholy thing.
Mm-hmm.
The Course in Miracles says there is nothing that is neutral, that this world is simply a product, literally, of our thoughts. The Course in Miracles says that everything we see is a product of our own thinking, and that God's world, the real world, is the love that is behind it all.
Yeah, I love that. You also use the language in the book of crucifixion and resurrection. And you do it in a unorthodox way, which I really appreciate. But I really appreciated how you emphasized the significance not only of crucifixion, but reminding readers about us being resurrection people.
Let me be very clear. There is nothing here that's critical of the
No, not
tradition
at
of the
all.
Christian
Yeah,
religion. And that's important.
very
No one
important.
is saying there was not a historic Jesus.
Right.
No one, there's nothing. In fact, there are enough references to make it clear, we get.
I
Sure.
felt like you were a better
But-
PR person for him than many preachers I had, to be honest.
Very true.
It's saying, I was saying to a friend today, all scripture it's like it was psychology before Freud. When he
Mhm.
said, my kingdom is not of this world. There was no psychology at that time.
Right.
It's the inner kingdom. It's the inner life. What we would say today, the psyche, right? So these religious stories, the birth of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus, the healings of Jesus, the crucifixion, and the resurrection of Jesus speak not only to a historical reality, but to the internal reality.
Right.
So a couple minutes ago, I said the ego is literally warring against God.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean? The ego is always saying, judge that person. You're better than that person, or you're worse than that person, or whatever. Anything to keep you in a state of believing that you're separate from that person, because the moment you let that go, that's the death of the ego. The ego is to the spirit what and to love. Fear is to love what darkness is to light. It's not a thing. It's the absence of a thing. As soon as love is there, it's replaced.
Right.
The crucifixion is what fear or ego would do to you and to your life.
Mm-hmm.
It's the part of your mind that says the stupid thing, does the stupid thing, undermines yourself, ruins the relationship, repels your friends, makes you fail. The ego is your own mind turned against you. And usually, and it's, it's like they talk in Alcoholics Anonymous about how it's very insidious. Most of us, when we do stupid things from ego, don't wake up in the morning and say, I want to do a stupid thing today.
Right.
I want to be a jerk today. I want to ruin my relationship with my husband today. No, when you're in it, the ego is your own mind turned against you. So some of our biggest mistakes we thought were good ideas when we did them because we're so trained by the thinking of the world. I'll give you an example. No, you need to get on the phone right now. You need to get on the phone right now and tell him that he cannot treat you that way. Now, when I was a kid, my mother would have said, count to 10 before you say anything. Today, because of texting and tweeting and social media, we have no impulse control.
Right.
We are saying things and going, oh my God, why did I say anything? If I'd only prayed first. Oh my God, if I'd only gone to God first, if I'd only gone into silence in the holy instant and asking the Holy Spirit to correct my thinking first. But we walked ahead of God because there's a term in both Christianity and Judaism called the small, still voice for God.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we need to pray. And that's why we need to spend time with God so that we can hear the voice for God. The cacophony of the world is that the ego speaks first and the ego speaks loudest. The ego says, no, this is not about forgiveness, okay? This is about the fact that you need to set a boundary and you need to call him right now.
Yeah.
And only later do you realize, oh my God, what did I do?
Yeah.
Right? So it's all about realizing that in having that relationship with God, putting God first means go home to God, go back to the moment of silence, and that is where you'll find your wisdom. But I have to ask you a question. What was the original question?
Well, no,
Everything.
you did a great job talking about it. I want to
Oh,
read.
wait, please define about the crucifixion and the resurrection.
Yeah, but I'm gonna read this one quote because it really stuck out to me because you've already used the quote that I had originally. That was crucifixion is ego's violence against God, against love, and against you. But then you pivot and start talking about resurrection. And you say this, the meaning of Easter is what happens in any moment when love and forgiveness overcome the fear-laden powers of the world. That's absolutely beautiful.
I want to talk, though, about those 3 days in between.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
You're a human being.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the 3 days between the crucifixion and the resurrection, much like the 40 years in the desert in the Old Testament, between slavery in Egypt and the entrance to the Promised Land, is the time it takes within the human experience to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So the consciousness, right? Jesus, there was somebody crucified to his right and crucified to his left. We didn't hear about them resurrecting.
Right.
The consciousness, when you're in the middle of the crucifixion, is what will determine how long those 3 days are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm willing to see this differently. I have faith in God. I am willing to forgive this person. Now, I have a friend, Sandy, who's a minister, who calls it tomb time. You know life is eternal, but you're grieving. This is not about pretending you're not grieving. It's those 3 days. And then when they come to retrieve the body, once again, going to the stories and their deeper significance, they're told he is not here, he's risen. The old you doesn't even exist. The old you has been lifted to an ultimate realization, which is only love is real here. Nothing. When he said, he who loves me sees me, will not see death.
Right.
The Course in Miracles says, physical birth is not the beginning, but a continuation. Physical death is not an end, but a continuation. But that is so contrary to the belief system of this world. Resurrection is when your mind is healed and you're at peace. The goal of the Course in Miracles is the attainment of inner peace.
Yeah. I love it.
And also, I think in the book, I talk about the Good Friday services.
Mhm.
That when
Yeah.
I worked at this church, and, I'm a non-denominational, but I teach about comparative religion,
Right.
and I'm Jewish. And I was told when I went to this church, and I was there in a minister, understanding it was, and they said, we do a Good Friday service. I said, well, I'm not a Christian minister. I don't know enough to, that's not something I can do. And it was made clear to me that the Good Friday services were very important to these people. So the more I read, the more I realized what Good Friday service was. And that in going into the suffering of Jesus on the cross, we are entering into the suffering of all the world, the suffering past, present, and future, every human, every animal, every aspect of the world, to really go into it. Jesus wept.
Mhm.
And what I go through in the book is that if you do that, because a lot of people want to skip the crucifixion today and go right to the resurrection.
Right.
That's not transcendence, that's denial.
Yep.
And then when we did that on Easter Sunday, this wasn't just about getting dressed up and singing hallelujah. This was an experience of joy that you wouldn't have gotten had you not borne witness to the agony and the suffering.
Mhm.
So you can't skip the crucifixion, and there's a lot of that in the world today. Let's throw a happy smiley face on top of everything.
Right.
And if that's the case, you don't have anywhere to put your suffering.
Yeah.
And before Freud, people in the olden days looked to religion for their solace, for their comfort. And then it passed to psychotherapy, and now it's passed to psychopharmacology. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are going, wait, we gotta, like you said,
Right.
we gotta look back and
Sure.
what's going on here.
Yeah. Well, Marianne Williamson, thank you so much for being our guest this week on Good Faith Weekly. Marianne's newest book, The Mystic Jesus, The Mind of Love, is available wherever you purchase your reading materials. But Marianne, before we let you go, we've got to ask you one last question, and Missy has the honor of asking it.
So, Marianne, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
I think we're living at a time when it's very important to tell one another, have faith. God, there is no spot where God is not. That we can't always see the new morning. It says in the Talmud, at the time of the darkest night, act as if the morning has already come. I think that these are very confusing times. These are very scary times for many people because of exactly how we started this. Things are falling apart.
Mm-hmm.
But another world is struggling to be born. And there is no night that is not followed by day. There is no crucifixion that is not followed by resurrection. And we need to keep telling each other that God has not abandoned us. God is within us. And that even though we can't see and always the dawn yet, the dawn is coming because God is good.
I love that.
Marianne Williamson, thank you so much for your words, your wisdom, and your work. It has been
Thank you
a
very
complete
much.
joy.
I'm honored to have been here. Thank you so much.
Well, Missy, I don't mind telling you that I have been anticipating and looking forward to this interview with Marianne for a couple of reasons. One of the things we did not get into in the interview is that Marianne Williamson is a former presidential candidate.
Yes.
But also just this whole mystic idea. I'm really challenged and inspired by it.
Okay, so I have a couple of things to say.
Okay.
12-year-old me is appalled right now.
12-year-old you's got your track out,
12-year-old
ready to
me
get somebody saved.
who walked the aisle and got baptized in spite of just debilitating fear of being in front of people, who got my ticket out of hell is, I mean, like I said, appalled. So
aghast and appalled.
But for me today is like, I think she might be a genius, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like I said in the interview, the whole mystic and Jesus were never paired together in my recollection, in my world, and in my classes, in my Bible studies, my church setting. And I feel like if they were, that would have been just, again, you would have been seen as like, that would have been seen as witchcraft in my mind.
Right.
And again, maybe I created this narrative in my head. I don't think so, but here it is. So after our interview, I went up and I looked up the definition of mystic. I was like, I need to know because it's just such an interesting term. And Google, you know, the
oracle for all
oracle
things. There's the Bible and then there's Google.
And there's Google. So
what is authoritative in your life?
The gospel according to Google says mystic is defined as a person who seeks contemplation and self-surrender to obtain unity with or absorption into the deity or the absolute, or who believes in the spiritual apprehension of truths that are beyond the intellect. And I'm like, okay, I think that sounds Jesus-y, right?
Are you a mystic now?
I mean, but I do have like, okay, so where's the problem in that as it relates to Jesus and as it relates to faith? I'm like, is that not pretty much what we're all seeking to do, to self-surrender to a deity, and believing there's truths beyond our intellect?
I think that is an excellent point. And so let me respond to that, because as I was listening to you talk and then thinking about our conversation with Marianne and the whole idea of the mystic Jesus, these thoughts came to my mind. One, when we talk about orthodoxy, and let's be clear, and she was clear in the interview, that this isn't a concept that's anti-orthodox. There are some good things about orthodoxy that she wants to pull from in her faith and in her life. But traditional orthodoxy, as you and I understood it, is this conforming or submission to a set of beliefs. Mm-hmm. Mysticism, as I understand it, is this constant pursuit of truth and belief. In other words, the idea of orthodoxy that we were familiar with, you could make a decision and claim about truth, and it was never going to change. It was the truth from the beginning to the end.
There was black and there was white.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For mysticism, there's always the opportunity to ask a question and a pursuit to draw closer to God and closer to your fellow human beings.
Yeah, and I loved, like, the more she was talking, the more it just makes me think of, you know, what you've talked about in kind of your native tradition about more of a communal outlook on faith. She talked about the sun, the ray of sun, the wave. She talked about the wheel. Like, how arrogant of us to think if we're a sunbeam that we're isolated from the sun or the other beams, or if you're a wave in isolation. That's not how our world works. We're all part of one, and we have this symbiotic relationship. And what, I mean, if you want to break it down, what has gotten us in all of the problems throughout history is us trying to think that we are separate from each other, is us trying to create factions, create hierarchy, create groups. I mean, that's kind of the root of everything. I don't know. I'm just talking off the cuff here, but it just makes me think that if we went back to, like you've said, your indigenous heritage and understanding that this symbiotic relationship with God's creation, with the earth, that we all depend on one each. Creation depends on creation, on each other, and we do our best to live harmoniously within that. What would things be like?
Yeah, and I think that is such a terrific point, and One of the things that I've struggled with in my deconstruction of my colonized self and colonized theology has been this idea of the identity of God. And I go back to my systematic theology course 101. 101. And the very thing you do is study about the doctrine of God and pursue this calculus, if you will, of trying to figure out the identity and purpose of the Creator, of God. And so often we draw conclusions based upon ourselves, that we truly are the center of the universe.
Well, we are the center of our own universe. I mean,
Right.
we've been taught that, shown that. We love that idea.
And to me, that is the colonized version of interpreting Scripture, is that there is a God, there is a divine presence, but the existence of God is there to serve humanity.
Mm-hmm.
The indigenous understanding of theology, and I'll even say I think it's biblical if you were to see the Hebrews as indigenous people. And I have discovered this in my own ancestry, is that we are part of a symbiotic relationship between the divine and basically the Creator and the created, that it's all working together. And so the existence of God is real and present, but the existence of God is in my life. It's through my life. It's in everything around me. And it's not pantheism, but it is this idea that there is this overall energy and providence that is present in the world. Mm-hmm. And we are all better off when we acknowledge it and understand it, and then try to live that presence and acknowledge that presence and respect that presence in each and everybody that we encounter. In other words, we're humanist from the standpoint, and this is one of the things I really like what she talked about. And she talked about the Course of Miracles, which we had to get her to define. But she said the Course is not about believing in God, but believing in one another. Mm-hmm. And by believing in one another, we are believing in God. That sounds very familiar to this Palestinian rabbi who spoke 2,000 years ago,
right,
when he said, love God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and love others as you would love yourself. It is this symbiotic relationship that humanity has within the divine.
I agree. And my head hurts.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. That really got me excited, though. I was talking systematic theology.
No,
there.
it's great. All of it's great. I love the new take. I've said it 1,000 times before on this podcast. I love when somebody can open a new portal for me and show me a different peek behind the curtain, so to speak, mm-hmm. of spirituality, of our life and our ethic and our faith. And she has opened another kind of idea for me. And I really appreciate that, especially because, as we talked about in the interview, I'm somebody who I know I'm very fear-based. I know this. I think it is part of who I am personality-wise. And then I was raised in a culture and in a faith community that really fed that. And so when she says, fear is to love what darkness is to light, I really have to think about that, mm-hmm. because it's true. And I see how in many ways it keeps a grip on me.
Yeah. And you were very vulnerable in our conversation with her when you admitted that you are fearful of giving up fear.
Oh, 100%.
So unpack that for us.
I mean, I don't know. My therapist is going to have to help with that.
But another thing I want to talk about, which really spoke to me, and we'll speak about this briefly, is when she was talking about how the ego is a barrier mm-hmm. To love and a barrier to the fulfillment of being human. And she gave the example of her daughter in her study of Henry VIII. Mm-hmm. And when Henry VIII left Catholicism behind in England and established the Church of England, what happened to all the monasteries across Great Britain? And more specifically, what happened to all the nuns?
The nuns who didn't have any support system, who didn't have, like she said, phones, no internet, no nothing, and you're just left out on the street. Yeah. And that's kind of how I'm feeling right now in this time that we're in history, when, churches are dwindling and people who have made their livelihood on serving the church mm-hmm. are now panicking and having to find other ways to make a living and, continue their life's work and their life's calling. And it's very scary. But yeah, what she said, you and I talked about it afterwards about, did people in the Renaissance time say, hey, we're living in the Renaissance? No. Right. So I've been trying to think, and I wish I could come up with something clever. I'm like, okay, in 100, 200, 300 years, what are people going to look back on our time and call it? Yeah. Like, I really want to come up with a clever name for it because I do feel like we're living in a time that is going to be termed something like that will be studied.
Yeah. When she was talking about that, it reminded me of a scholar I read a long time ago, and I cannot remember the name of the scholar, but the scholar was pointing out how quickly culture is changing these days in the time period that we live in. And the point that scholar made was this: Shakespeare is closer in culture to Jesus than we are to Shakespeare. And that really kind of blew my mind, but I think the scholar was right. What the point being is that we are living in a time that is changing so quickly. Mm-hmm. A lot of people call this the information age. Mm-hmm. I think it is the sharing of information, whether that is truthful information or misinformation. Mm-hmm. That is where we are today. And we're still living, believe it or not, even though we have all this advancement in technology, we are still living from the ramifications of the Gutenberg press. Mm-hmm. When Gutenberg began printing all of those pamphlets, all of a sudden information was at the hands of anybody who sought it out. And today it comes quicker, faster,
without accuracy.
Without accuracy and fact check. But we're still living in the ramifications of that. And this is changing who we are as human beings and as a human race. And I think you're right. We're living in a pivotal time, but we just need a better marketing director to come up with the name.
Oh, yes. I agree. I have only one final thought.
Okay.
Long live the cats.
Long live the cats. Absolutely.
We're all going to be subject to them soon. People who have cats know it. You're subject to them.
The cats already know it. They have no time for us. It's like they're running their world. So.
Their world. We're living in it, you guys.
That's right. Well, I really enjoyed our conversation with Marianne Williamson. Our book is The Mystic Jesus and the Mind of Love. And thanks for talking politics with me and systematic theology.
Man, that's been stressful. I need a drink now.
Well, we'll be back next week. And until then, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.